Ya nai nai na nai nai na nai 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 ya na na nai na nai 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 he na na nai nai na nai nai na nai 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 he na na nai na nai nai ya nai yai hi ya 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 na 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 ya na 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 ya na na ya na ya na 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 ya ya na 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 ya na na hi ya 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 na 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 ya na ya na 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 ya na na na. Shalom, shalom, beautiful friends. It's great to see you. Great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. We are in for a doozy today. Hobbes versus the Anarchists, a king versus no king. We're going to start with a poll. You probably wonder what such a poll question would be. How much do we need the state to protect us? Number one, I support anarchy. We should be highly skeptical of all forms of government and should limit their powers in all ways possible. Option two, governments always have a lot of good and a lot of bad, and we need strong government, but also strong checks on it. Option three, big government is a big part of the answer to solving major social problems. Option four, government is central to all, and even monarchies and tyrants are crucial to uphold social order. Okay, this is a tough one. Let's see where you're going to fall out here. Let's see what you're going to do. Can't wait to see what you're going to do here. Can't wait to see. I'm on edge. Okay, let's see our results, if we have results yet. I know it's a real tricky one. Ooh, wow, a big divide. Okay, so we have 0 anarchists here. Phew. Okay. If you wanted to vote but didn't get to yet, I'm sorry. If you're the anarchist, you didn't get to vote yet. Government is central to everything, even for tyrants. Nobody's over there also. Phew. Okay, and in the middle, as usual, in the middle, 50% government's a lot of good and bad, and government is a big part of the answer to solving problems. Okay, a lot of good stuff here. All right, let's see how Jewish thought plays out on this crucial question. God is Hamelech, the king. We don't need any earthly king to govern us. That is the approach that many Jewish thinkers have taken. And while all agree that we need some form of governance, establishing a court or governing system is one of the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, by the way. Right before Har Sinai, there are the 7 Noahide laws. The only question being whether that should entail having a king. Other Jewish thinkers have suggested that a monarchy is a perfectly fine, perhaps even ideal government model. So with the advent of modernity, we witness the opportunity to uproot and dismantle the old order. Think Les Mis. Think Les Mis. Do you hear the people sing? Think the play Hamilton and fighting back against the Brits. Think about revolutions. And so some were revolutionaries, while others were desperately working to preserve order. Which side would you have been on? Would you have been on the side of the French monarch? Would you have been on the side of the Brits taxing the new Americans? Or would you be on the side of revolutionaries trying to dismantle the monarchies? This is where Thomas Hobbes comes in. Hobbes famously argued that by a right of nature, one would feel they have no obligations. One would also assume they are free to do anything in the name of survival and live a life of self-interest. He thus contends that we need government power to control humanity from eating each other alive. Hobbes rejected the assumption that by our nature we are sociable. The other major civilizations, such as the Greeks and Christian culture, had largely assumed that we were inclined to live with each other. Hobbes thought our nature is isolation and self-interest, and the living collectively is extremely difficult, and therefore needs to be tightly governed. We would need contracts to manage order in society, and those contracts must be strictly enforced. Ethics for Hobbes is something else. Ethics leads us to go beyond our nature and beyond governance into the realm of doing what is good for others, beyond what is good for oneself. Now, to be sure, the Talmudic rabbis had themselves offered such an idea that government was needed primarily to prevent violence, long before Hobbes did. It says here famously in Pirkei Avot 3:2, Rav Chanina, the vice high priest, said, "Pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear it inspires, every person would swallow their neighbor alive." So again, the Pirkei Avot is saying here, government is needed, even bad government, because it maintains social order. People will massacre one another if no one is keeping order. However, it also makes clear that that may be the sole or primary goal of government. And so here you can imagine someone supporting big government using this Pirkei Avot, saying, see, you see how crucial the rabbis say government is? And you can imagine a libertarian who wants to limit government showing this text, saying, see, you see how the rabbis think the sole role of government is to maintain order. And that's it. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg directly connects the above teaching with Hobbes. He says this is a Hobbesian view. Since people act out of power and selfishness, they would be in a state of perpetual warfare with each other, were it not for the restraining power of the government. By this logic, as Hobbes argued, government has the right to be authoritarian and not subject to the changing will of the citizens. You know, some people claim, geez, wouldn't it be great if America was China right now? Because China can just say, COVID, pandemic, everyone has to follow this protocol. And if you don't, you go to jail or we'll kill you. You know what I mean? In America, we're like, okay, there's this concept of freedom, and you know the courts are going to undermine if you go too far in trying to impose your public health mandates upon businesses and the public and the private enterprise and the private home. And so some people will say, good, the freedom is good, and others people say, wouldn't it be good if we were a little more authoritarian? So this said, the rabbis, to be sure, were addressing living under a foreign king. Obviously, the rabbis didn't know anything about sovereignty. When it comes to a king of Israel, the biblical and the rabbinic texts speak with ambivalence towards the king. So that's interesting. You would have thought they said Jewish king good, non-Jewish king bad, but the opposite. They're saying, oh, non-Jewish king, we need that, right? The people are going to have pogroms and crusades. They're going to massacre us if there's nobody kind of overseeing some order, right? Of course, the monarchs were just as bad to us as the masses. But if it's a Jewish king, we're not sure we want a Jewish king. So looking back at Tanakh, we see this conversation emerges during the period of the Shoftim, the book of Shoftim, Sefer Shoftim, the Judges. The text demonstrates that prior to Israelite monarchies, Israel's society was anarchistic, right? It was anarchy prior to the Melech emerging. Right? We had judges. Prior to judges, we had other forms of prophets. It says famously over here in Judges 21:25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every person did that which was right in their own eyes. The prophet Shmuel, Shmuly, the great prophet Shmuly, Samuel, he critiques the Jews for wanting a king. Why should we want to be like all the other nations, he asks. What do we want to be like them for? We should do what's right out of love of God and a desire to live a virtuous life, not out of fear of a king, right? To be sure, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who are also anti-Zionist, even if they live in Israel, also like, what do we need a state for? We live under God. We don't need a state. Further, we should build a government that actualizes a Torah lifestyle, he argued, not one of political expediency emulated after the surrounding nations. We don't want to be like them. We don't want a seat at the United Nations, right? The people were explicit in their asserting that other nations are the example they want to follow. Here's what it says in Judges 8:20. So that we too may be like all the other nations, that our king may lead us and go before us and fight our wars. That was part of the critique, is that they didn't say, we want justice, we want security. They said, we want to be like them, right? That's the great argument of assimilationist. Just let us be like everyone else, right? We don't want a great country club. We want a country club that's as good as theirs. We don't want a good Jewish donut. We want a donut as good as Dunkin' Donuts, right? We don't want a state that's like the model of Jewish ethics and spirituality. We want a state just like all the other people have a state. But Shmuel objects, both on practical grounds, because a king will abuse his power, and also on theological grounds, because the Lord your God is your king. It says there in Samuel, book of Shmuel, our great prophet Shmuly. We love him. But by the way, this is also those who oppose women's ordination in women being rabbis. Their argument on traditional grounds primarily was on the argument of srara. It's called srara. Only a man could be king, was the argument. I mean, it's hard to believe we still don't have a woman president in America, right? Only a man could be king, and thus have authority, and thus only a rabbi could be a male, because the authority of the rabbinate is based off the authority of the malchut, of the kingship. And so that was easy for liberal Judaism. They said, well, we're not interested in rabbis as authorities. Rabbis can be pastors. I want my rabbi to lead bar and bat mitzvahs and to do funerals and to meet with me when I'm depressed, right? I don't want a rabbi to be a person who gives me answers, right, to what to do on Pesach or how to handle, sitting Shiva. This is not an authority. This is a pastor. In Orthodoxy, a rabbi is still an authority. And so Srara applied. And so they said a woman can't be a rabbi because they don't have authority, because a woman could be king. Okay, that's a whole different argument, but just a little side bit of interesting argumentation. There is further reason to object. In many cultures, such as the Philistine and the Egyptian cultures, the king is considered to be a god. The king is God. Pharaoh is God, part of the Godhead. In the Torah, however, every king was assigned a prophet to keep him at bay and remind him and society of his imperfection. Right? What a great role of the prophet. Every king in Tanakh is given a prophet to follow him along and be like, can't do that. Going too far. Like you're not following the word of God, right? You are not following justice. And every king wants to imprison and kill that prophet. Nonetheless, there's always a prophet there. But it is not hard for a king to come to believe himself to be a god. And so we must avoid raising up humans to too high places of glory, right? Even in a democracy where you're going to elect public officials, there need to be checks and balances. So later, rabbis want us to avoid engaging with governments. Here's what they say again in Pirkei Avot 110. Love labor, hate mastery, and avoid relationship with the government, right? But hate mastery, actually, the phrase there really is hate the rabbanut, hate the rabbanut. But avoid relationship with the government. You should not be eager to get the invite to the White House. You should not be eager to show up at the governor's mansion. You shouldn't be eager to be on the inside. You want to be a Jew? A Jew stands on the outside, never corrupted by the inside. Yes, you might sometimes have to use your power and privilege on the inside to agitate, but really, you don't want to be corrupted by being an insider. You always want to be on the margins, aligned with the most vulnerable, rather than aligned with the most powerful. Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapiro of Piazetzna, the Piazetzna Rebbe, wrote, in a place where holiness is revealed, there is no rulership and honors. Right? In a true place of holiness, there's only equality. There's only equality, not power as such. Similarly, friends, we can ask, why was the Torah given in the desert outside the land of Israel? If the pinnacle of the journey for the Jewish people was arriving in the land, then shouldn't the revelation happen then? Shouldn't Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, be in Israel? Right? We leave Egypt, we journey 40 years, we enter Israel, and boom, there's the divine presence. But that's not what happens. The divine presence happens outside of the Holy Land. Rather, one might suggest that the Torah was given in the desert, in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, precisely because it is outside of society, outside of government, and outside of sovereignty itself. The 19th to 20th century Polish Kabbalist, Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, taught, and if you've never learned any Ashlag, then we just made our day, right? You said, you might have been saying this morning, if only someone would share some Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag with me, right? I could have a good day. But you didn't know you were going to have a good day because you never learned Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag before until now. It's amazing. And so here we go, right? Maybe you thought your day was good because you're going to play some pickleball. Oh, or maybe you thought the day was going to be good because you have a great lunch coming up. All of that is good, but we have Ashlag here. Here's what he says. Altruistic communism will finally annul the brute force regime completely. For every man did that which was right in his eyes, quoting that source from Judges we saw. Indeed, there is nothing more humiliating and degrading for a person than being under the brute force of government. He wants anarchy. Now, there were some Orthodox thinkers who were anarchists as well, such as British Orthodox Rabbi Yankee Meir Zalkin. Maybe you never heard of him. The above-mentioned Kabbalist, Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, Chabad rabbi of the early to mid-20th century, Rav Avraham Yehuda Chaim, Chabad Rabbi Yehuda Leib Don Yachia, Rabbi Aharon Shmuel Tameret of early 20th century Poland, among others. Some are, now it's interesting, Chabad is to the far right politically, and a lot of that is the emergence of the Rebbe out of Russia and the relationship to Russian governments. And yet also we see here anarchists out of the Lubavitch world as well. Some are drawn towards spiritual ideas that are anti-authoritarian. Once again, only God is king. We don't want a human king, right? But some are drawn also by political ideas as anti-nationalist or anti-Zionist even. Others support libertarian communism. Still, there's others who may simply reject all forms of government they see around them. They're only thinking about what they see around them with all the coercion and corruption that they witness. Rabbi Soloveitchik at times champions a form of anarchism as well, suggesting that humans are meant to be free and not restrained. He only concedes that there needs to have law and order to prevent a breakdown of society. Once again, Hobbes. Consider this passage in his book, The Emergence of Ethical Man. Bondage to man excludes divine friendship. The beloved must tear down all the social and political barriers that fence in the individual and imprison his initiative and liberty, right? Any barriers to freedom are going to limit our actualization, right? This is like also like a child who's like any rule their parent gives them is like complete oppression, right? My daughter last night, we gave her a lollipop, like a rare lollipop at night for a special occasion, and this was like a travesty that she couldn't have an additional treat in addition to this lollipop. It was like she wanted total anarchy. Like any rule at this point was complete oppression, and everything we taught her about community organizing and protesting was now emerging in our home front around her organizing her siblings in complete, resistance to the authorities at home. The charismatic person is anarchic, liberty-loving. He frees himself from all the fixed formulas and rhythms of an urbanized civilization and joins a fluid, careless, roving nomad society. An ancient Egyptian document describes the nomads as follows. Here is the miserable stranger. He does not dwell in the same spot. His feet are always wandering. From times of Horus he battles. He does not conquer and is not conquered. The stranger is indomitable. He may lose a battle, but never lose a war. He will never reconcile with political subjection. Roaming, wandering, he will escape persecution and oppression. When the need arises, the nomad stands up and fights for his freedom, and many times a time proves superior in battle to the settled king. Abraham's heroism on the battlefield is the best illustration. Now, what Rav Soloveitchik has just done here is he's saying the refugee, the immigrant, is the hero not only because they are willing to flee and they're willing to be vulnerable for a better life, but also because they are fundamentally stateless. They are fundamentally someone who is not subject to a ruler, right? This is kind of counterintuitive here. But essentially, these people are heroic in their anarchy, their nature of anarchy. They are willing to flee one government and submit the rule of law in another government by arriving as such. And as such, believe there is an ethic and there is a God beyond the power of the nation state. Of course, far more than religious anarchists have been the Jewish secular anarchists, right? You get some Jewish religious anarchists, but many, many secular anarchists, such as Emma Goldman. If you've never read of Emma Goldman, you should read of her. Mikhail Bakunin, Leo Tolstoy, of course, and Noam Chomsky, who happens to be in our VBM learning library, as we interviewed him 2 years ago and 2 days ago, 2 years and 2 days ago. Relatedly, figures such as Martin Buber and Gershon Shalom argued for non-nationalist manifestations of Zionism. But in the end, monarchy won out in Jewish history. The Jews embraced countless Jewish kings, and Jewish traditional teachings on messianism argue that the monarchy will return. Monarchy is not an only ideal of the past and a concession to the current, but also a messianic vision of the future. But where does that leave us now? We have an ancient Jewish history of monarchs and a future eschatological destiny of monarchs. But what about in modern times? Today, Jews live with unparalleled history under Israeli sovereignty and participate in a sovereign government in the United States. Of course, both the United States and Israeli governments are democracies, well, mostly. But all Jews must abide by the decisions and laws of those governments just the same. One could argue that Jews have never been safer in even one location in all of history, not to mention in 2 locations simultaneously. Both Israeli and American security requires strong governments. So merely on the level of self-protection, it is simple to make a case for strong centralized government. But even beyond that, the state of Israel and the United States do enormous good for the global community. Of course, even alongside the inevitable harm that each does. Professor Michael Walzer, may he live and be well, argues that the monarchy model sows the roots for later democracy. You can see our VBM interview with Professor Walzer, fascinating stuff, Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. So do we want an authoritarian king today? No, of course not. But does our traditional embrace of the monarchy set a trajectory toward the arguably most desirable form of government, democracy? Yes. Walzer says we need the monarchy to ultimately build a stepping stone towards democracy, and that the Bible helps us get there. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in The Dignity of Difference and other works of his, argues that there must be more than just government and the market. Liberals want bigger government and more regulations on the market. Conservatives want smaller government and less regulations on the market. But Rabbi Sachs argues there must be a third space, right? Just to state that again. Liberals want big government and more regulations on the market. Conservatives want smaller government, less regulations on the market. And Sachs wants a third space called society. Yes, there is a need for government and for a marketplace, but we need the realm of ideas, communities, and values to inform how both of these operate. Some people think the whole vehicle to change is the market. Some people think the whole vehicle to change is the government. And Sachs says, no, both of those have a role, but the role of religion, the role of intellectuals, the role of volunteerism, that is called the marketplace of ideas. And that is where the greatest change can take place and where we will have the best potential to shape the market and to shape the government. There's just so much that governments, whether in the form of monarchy or democracy, cannot do for us. Here's what Peter Singer writes in Ethics in the Real World. Governments can't legislate happiness or ban depression, but public policy can play a role in ensuring that people have time to relax with friends and pleasant places to do it. For many governments, both national and local, preventing crime is a far higher priority than encouraging friendship and cooperation. But as Professor Richard Layard of the London School of Economics has argued in his recent book, Happiness, Lessons from a New Science, promoting friendship is often easy and cheap and can have big payoffs in making people happier. So why shouldn't that be a focus of public policy? So friends, both the strong liberals and the strong conservatives are wrong. The strong conservative says, oh, it's all in the realm of the market, right? There's no role of government in achieving the good, right? Aside from maybe some having an army to protect us. And the liberals are wrong that advocating for justice is going to solve all problems. The government can do everything, right? Of course, there's a role for government policy, and of course there's a role for markets, and yet the role of community, the role of Jewish community, of synagogues, of Christian community, Muslim community, of secular society, of places where we come together, we volunteer, we learn, we talk, we reach out, we build families and communities. That is the role that governments cannot play and markets can't play. And so for those of us living in America today, where does that leave our thinking? Susan Neiman, who writes in her great book, Moral Clarity, she's also a professor at Princeton University, great book. She writes, Americans, she's quoting here Robert Kagan, Americans, he concluded, are Hobbesians. Remember Hobbes? While Europeans are Kantians. Europeans have withdrawn into a cocoon that is shielded from the harsh circumstances of conflict, only because the US remains in the anarchic and unstable center of history. Acknowledging how bad things really are and using military power to prevent them from falling apart entirely. Europeans think we have reached the Kantian dream, in which ideas of peaceful negotiation, international courts, and common concern for sharing global wealth makes things work. But though we too would like to live in a dream world, Americans recognize the hard facts of this one and are resolute enough to respond to them, thereby taking on the burdens that allow Europeans to dream on. It is very difficult to stop thinking about Hobbes' idea and the social contract, even more so as the global political drama continues to unfold. His case for how a governmentless society would lead to the war of every man against every man, in which life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Without a government that holds control, humans would live in a natural state of constant war. Everyone would be, in Hobbes' words, constantly afraid and living in continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We witness this reality in the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. As unhappy as we can be with the state of nation states today and the chosen officials, we can still work to muster up the appreciation that most of these regimes are maintaining some order and preventing lawless chaos. We have a sacred obligation to protest the unjust policies of governments, but it is also wise and our responsibility and obligation on some level to support the order that governments provide to society, even when we disagree with the elected officials running them. Tyrants, despots, and fascists excluded, of course. It's not easy to strike the right balance between protesting and supporting governments that are misguided. But each of us can learn to play our unique role. Hobbes still provides us something to think about 350 years after his death. And so, in democracy today, rather than submit to authority, we should argue about the just society safely and fairly. The 20th century American author and activist, a Quaker thinker, Parker Palmer, writes, human beings have a well-demonstrated capacity to hold the tension of differences in ways that lead to creative outcomes and advances. It is not an impossible dream to believe we can apply that capacity to politics. In fact, our capacity for creative tension building is what made the American experiment possible in the first place. As I argue in this book, America's founders, despite the bigotry that limited their conception of who we the people were, had the genius to establish the first form of government in which differences conflict and tension were understood not as the enemies of a good social order, but as the engines of a better societal order. He continues, from the separation of powers and systems of checks and balances among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, to the tug of war between federal and state governments, to our adversarial system of justice, American democracy was intended to generate, not suppress, the energy created by conflict, converting it into social progress as a hydroelectric plant converts the energy of dammed up water into usable power. Friends, to move towards a conclusion here, American democracy was developed to be specifically in contrast to a monarchy. By dividing up power between executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, for example, the framers of the US Constitution sought to avoid any absolute claims to power. This was also, in many ways, the electoral process, and in some cases, although subject to debate today, a process of filibuster, having larger majorities to create changes. Democracy can be a way to balance our spiritual pull toward anarchy with our spiritual pull toward monarchy. We seek order and control, but we also seek to make God the only one above us. We don't want lawlessness, but we don't want tyranny either. Democracy in its best form provides order and checks and balances, but also ensure there is no authoritarian king. What matters in a democracy, as opposed to a monarchy, is that an election takes place and that there is accountability after the election. I think we may need to consider moving away from thinking of a monarchy as a valid future Jewish model, aside from a newer version, the figurehead model that we see in modern countries today, such as Thailand and Britain. Our Jewish case for democracy does not need to be a literal one. Rather, we should be consequentialists. The Torah wants a just society, and choosing a political society is in some ways a means to an end of creating the just society. Of course, the means must be just as well, honoring the dignity of the citizens. The Torah wants us to be healthy, but that doesn't mean that we follow medieval science. So too, we need a healthy society, but dare not revert to anarchic, possibly even dangerous models. We are left with many questions today. We see different types of democracies around the world. Which model do we believe leads to the best consequences and ought to be the Jewishly embraced form of modern government? And outside the role of persuasive educator and religious leader, what should the political power be of a philosopher king Messiah? These questions and more are worth pondering as we do our utmost during our lifetime and form of government to preserve and better society. Okay, friends, I'd love to hear from you on this age-old debate starting in Tanakh and beyond. Yes, Lauren.
Okay, I have some comments to make on monarchy and some comments to make on the role of government. I am a subject of Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. You're a Canadian, Shmuly, so are you. I think you're forgetting that there's a different form of monarchy and that actually democracy started in there's Greece, but I mean, modern democracy started in Great Britain with a prime minister and a cabinet and the whole parliamentary procedure. And all of the countries that were once colonies of Great Britain now live under a parliamentary democracy, which I believe works extremely well. So as far as, and the monarch at this point is really just a figurehead. Queen Elizabeth has been exemplary. She's a wonderful role model. As far as Jewish monarchy, when you learn Sefer Malachim, Aleph and Beit, Gewalt, it was a mess. The kingdom went from bad to worse. David, not so bad. Shlomo started all good, and then it all fell apart. And the kings after that, with a few exceptions, were disasters and brought us to the destruction of the Beit Midrash through Avodah Zarah. I want to mention government. So I tend to see Americans as too anarchic. I really do, with all due respect. I think like this whole freedom thing is like, you need responsibility. So this, I won't have a vaccine because I don't care about my own health. Why should I care about anybody else? I won't wear a mask. That's not freedom. That's crap. You don't have the right to go around infecting other people. Typhoid Mary she was jailed for a good reason. You could see how, ask me, how do I really feel about COVID laws? So, I think that with freedom comes responsibility, and government also has a reason. Well, they have their role is to provide me with health care, to make sure I'm a Canadian, to make sure that there aren't guns running loose on the street, to make sure I have clean water, hopefully at this point now to give clean water to our First Nations. But without government, we're really in bad shape. And I really think that there's a real reason to follow laws that are for the good of the nation. Okay, that's it.
Okay, tell us what you really think, Lauren.
For a Canadian, I'm very, very passionate.
No, it's great. I think every Canadian should have American Zoom audiences, or the bash down America. No, really, because Canada is a model. And no, but thank you. No, and I appreciate your points. And it is really important that that we emphasize the power of democracy and the threats to democracy, and fake freedom, as you talk about, that the freedom to do as whatever one pleases without any restraints. We know the threats to democracy in America are very real today, whether it emerges from the insurrection, whether it emerges from gerrymandering, whether it emerges from filibusters or electoral college. There are many different threats to how democracy operates, whether it emerges from ignorance. On the progressive side, the conservative side, the centrist side, people who just aren't educated and they just have no idea what they're voting for. They just vote for their, whatever their bandwagon says to do. Or elect people who are most charismatic, who really have no clue what they're doing. This is not democracy, the will of the masses. This is deception. Now, one of the areas that this question of anarchy emerges today in kind of a hidden form is not in anti-democracy. I think even the anti-democracy folks are rarely saying we're anti-democracy. They're just claiming that it needs to be reshaped. But actually, I think some of the things you see about dismantling authority. For example, in the far left, you hear about dismantling the police, right? The complete dismantling of the police force. That the argument there is police force is inevitably and pervasively and completely a branch of white supremacy, and thus the entire police force has to be defunded and dismantled. That's really anarchy in the end. When you strip the government of a means to physically protect society. Now that's not me saying there isn't major police brutality and problems of white supremacy in the police force, but we should be clear that, and also people who say something like banish ICE, basically banish any form of policing of borders, is also another form of anarchy. That a government has an obligation to its citizens to also protect borders in addition to maintaining order in society. We can debate what are just immigration policies or not, but saying that one should banish ICE is the same as dismantling the police force, is essentially another form of call for anarchy, a banning of the government's role of its understanding of protecting society from internal or external threats. And so there are all kinds of calls of anarchy today that look very different in the past. It's not no government. It is the government should have, or a pacifist who says the government should never go to war. That would also be a form of anarchy. Anything that strips the government of a fundamental capacity to achieve its means to protect society, whether we agree or disagree with the way they're doing it, would be a form of anarchy. Yes, Michael.
There's another factor now I don't think we've ever seen before too. And that is what the impact of technology is having in our ability to form consensus, our ability to have a similar understanding of the view of the world we're in. And I think, we naively thought 20, 30 years ago with the emergence of the internet, we'd all have greater communication and be able to, and it's actually fractured. And I don't think we know how the impact and how this is going to evolve in time, and how within this new information environment and technology, we form consensus, we form, shared views on things. And I think that's a real question that is good, which is also opened up from foreign interference. How much of what we've seen is also an impact of foreign countries messing around in our system in terms of a belief system and view of that.
Yeah, great point. Those are great points. Those external threats to democracy as well. Not to mention social media, the forms of social media that block some things and don't block other things, and the foreign threats, as we saw with Russia. By the way, just one correction. When I was referring to ICE earlier, what I really meant to refer to was Border Patrol. ICE is a much later creation, after 9/11, but Border Patrol is really what I was referring to over there. But yes, Michael, thank you for those important points as well.
Shmuly.
Yes, hi, Cheryl.
Hi. So you mentioned that anarchy on the far left, it would, to defund the police and everything like that. But isn't it really a form of anarchy on the far right when there are laws in place to say we should banish the laws, for example, about getting vaccines? Here's the law that's been established. I mean, so there's anarchy, really tendencies on both sides, just because I think I said it maybe in last week's too about how polarized we are. There's really very little middle ground anymore. Everything is open to interpretation. So the laws seem to have lost their value and certainly their strength. And that, that would say on both sides, I think, too.
Right. Yeah, that is a great point. Absolutely. That is one of the many examples on the far right of a call towards anarchy. The attempt to say that government has no role in regulating my body when my choices can affect another person. Now, again, there's huge. Yeah,
it's so hypocritical. I mean, you can, it's when it's convenient. That they should have a comma when it's convenient.
Okay. Yes. So we will bracket the debates of the seemingly overlaps of abortion laws and how they kind of intersect or are parallel to public health laws in regards to public safety and the like, and the rights to choose and the rights to be free with what one does with one's body. But yes, ultimately quite convenient. And so, yeah, I very much appreciate that. And I think also similar, there are many laws that are laws but aren't enforced. And those are also a problem. For example, minimum wage laws are not enforced. The Department of Labor, you hear of ICE raids where immigration law is enforced and a factory gets raided and they take 100 or 200, workers from Guatemala and deport them. But when have you ever heard of a labor raid? When have you heard of a labor raid where they raid a factory where there's 200 workers being paid below minimum wage and they raid and arrest the owner? You don't, because the Department of Labor does not regulate minimum wage laws by and large. It is completely underfunded. And so, yeah, there's a whole bunch of, kind of functional or practical anarchies that are in place that is kind of a lawless form of society. Yes, Eddie.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Cheryl, we'll come back to you after Eddie,
yeah. I'm loving this conversation. And I think that there always needs to be a balance. There needs to be a shift in balance of what we look at as far as governmental support and as far as what we look at like liberation and freedom. It's funny. There's an example of what happens when you don't have any sort of government support. There's a small city in New Hampshire that was purchased by a group of people they considered themselves libertarians. And they completely lived without any government support. And the city failed. And does anybody want to guess why the city failed? It failed because of bears. Bears are the reason why it failed. there was nobody picking up trash. So people were just dumping out trash. This happened in New Hampshire, and people were just dumping out trash. So first recorded ever bear attacks in New Hampshire were reported because people no longer had trash pickups, no longer had paramedics. So people were dying from bear attacks because paramedics weren't showing, law enforcement wasn't showing. So I believe there needs to be a proper balance to what we're saying. And when we're looking at like law enforcement, and I like when we're saying, like we see some folks are saying like abolish police in those circles. I think that that language really isn't what they're trying to portray, because what they're trying to portray is really looking at the sense of when we look at policing in North Scottsdale versus South Scottsdale. There's like hyper policing in South Phoenix, sorry. There's like hyper policing in South Phoenix versus in North Scottsdale. You barely see one police officer per every 30 minutes that you drive around a block. So in that case, there is lowered policing. And we can see that in societies, we have already proven to live pretty well with lowered policing, because the cities up north here don't really have that policing. So I think that there needs to be a shift in balance, right? In a balance where we're not saying like tear down everything, because we've seen that fundamentally that has been flawed. But there also needs to be a system of balance where we say, well, there can't be too much control.
Awesome points from Eddie. This shifting of balance, not neither extreme of too much control nor of anarchy, but the shifting of balance. And as Eddie points out, this government role of preserving the collective good with schooling and a whole bunch of other things, even sanitation, as pointed out with the bears. A whole bunch of roles that the government has to play for the collective good. In addition to the role of government for collective good, the question also emerges in our literature around motives. Why do people do what they do? And one way to define being religious, in addition, aside from being ethical, is a concern for purity of motives. Being ethical may just be about doing the good thing, not doing the bad thing. Being religious is why you do the ethical, right? And one might be ethical because they don't do X, Y, and Z wrongs or harms. And yet, if they don't do it because they don't want to go to jail, is that a religious person or someone who's just preserving themselves? Part of the religious call for less regulation is about people doing things out of their own motives. Now, there's also a problem to that. Consider the argument of don't tax me because we will just be philanthropic to sustain all the systems that collectively nurture us. Well, we know that's just not true. That when there's lower taxation, philanthropy doesn't just increase. Americans still give around 1%, and so it's not like lower taxation leads to higher philanthropic commitment, of some form or another. And so I think this case of like, how do we maintain governmental control, but also maintain deeper spiritual and moral motives for why we do what we do, rather than just to follow laws. Let's hear what Cheryl was about to say, and then we'll go to Eileen.
I was just actually to Eddie's point about the bears kind of indirectly, but the whole the whole government trying to manage climate change is certainly something too that is being disavowed as a real problem on some sides. And but there's laws in place. I mean, a lot of they've put the laws in place. So to that end, now with all the car manufacturers coming out with electric cars and things like that, so they're beginning to follow the law by addressing some of the problems. But I was thinking that climate change is another area where it's a convenient thing for people to say, well, I won't do this, I won't do that, and yet it's right in front of their face with these poor souls in the Midwest, with this most recent weather catastrophe. So, the government trying to regulate climate change, if it doesn't have to do with the bears, but it kind of does.
Yeah, that's another great case. Like, there's so many cases where I wish the government would regulate me, on environmentalism. I'm like, I'm buying these disposables, like they're here, I need them, I want them, I'm buying this gas, I'm gonna use this gas, but I wish like government, like don't let me buy this, I wish I could always live by the highest levels, but I can't. So I need you to step in and make me buy the things I need to buy, make it accessible, so yeah, so thank you. It's that's powerful. Eileen.
It seems to me that anytime we have extremes, either the far right or the far left, we get things occurring that logically and maybe morally should not, because their belief is so strong in what they're doing that they have no ability to understand another perspective. And as long as we are a divided society, and I'm going to say based on education, we're going to have problems. We're not going to be able to be cohesive. We were cohesive in World War II because we saw the enemy. We recognized the enemy. Today, our fellow Americans are the enemy.
That, you raise a great point, and I think this is a really important process towards our ability to advocate for what's right and just without having to go to demonize. It can't be, we live in a society where everyone on the left thinks that if you lean right, that you are naturally like a racist hater. And everyone on the right thinks if you lean to the left, you just want selfish entitlements, and are all about yourself. And like we have to break out of that. There's ways to advocate and not think that way. And I think that's the start, is to understand that people hold the values they hold for a reason. And we could try to persuade them to think of it differently. But everyone is not just full of hate who argues for their own ideology. And so to create a shift, I think the real shift that's going to happen is not just from just some political win that one side or another is going to get. It's going to happen by those who are really in the process of education, helping people talk, understand, think through critical issues, and create a larger cultural shift. So thank you. Thank you for that. Who else wants to jump in here?
Shmuly, can you hear me?
Oh, Steve, now we hear
Steve.
you.
Oh my God, it works.
Great.
I can't believe
Yeah.
it.
Yes,
I can
Steve.
see and I can hear.
Great.
The collective good. I'm obsessed by words. I was an English literature major in college, admittedly for the want of something else. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I always got stuck on words. And there are a couple of words that have come up today. One is selfish, the other is self-interest. And I kind of thought they were one and the same, that to be interested in things that are important to you is kind of selfish because you're thinking of yourself, but that does not mean you're thinking to the exclusion of society. And we also mentioned common good. And how do we determine what common good is? Who says this is common good? So those are the little burrs underneath my saddle today. And number three, and this is something everybody has talked about today, the power of certain words and how they become so tangibly offensive. For instance, I learned that I am a thing. I'm an optimist, and optimism is now a thing. I had no idea optimism was a thing. I thought, I'm lucky. I'm an optimist. I've lived for a long time. I've seen a lot of problems. I saw a National Guard in Baltimore coming down to downtown Baltimore in 1968 with bayonets drawn, preventing me and my dad to get to his office. And that doesn't happen anymore. I am an optimist because I've seen things, goodness prevail, and I know good people. So I don't know where I'm going with that, except to say that words have taken on a whole identity unto themselves, and I pass from there.
Awesome, awesome, Steve. That's a great place for us to wrap up on this reflections between when does self-interest become selfishness? When is self-interest valid and natural and normal? And when is it a self-absorption or a selfishness to the exclusion or harm of others? And the common good, who's defining that? Who's even cultivating a shared discourse of common good? As Isaiah Berlin said, the freedom to and freedom from. We have the freedom from, that's one role of government, keep us free from something. But then we also have the role of freedom to, that now that we're free from something, what are we free to do? And that's called the common good. What are we going to do with our freedom ultimately? And that leads us to optimism, that if we look at this history and we look at the progress we've seen, we have good reasons to think that from anarchy to monarchy to democracy and other forms, that we are in many ways moving in good directions. And so on that note, I hope we can all continue to be optimistic and not just a passive optimism, but an active one where we continue to learn and continue to bring that learning into action in order to repair our society. Friends, next week we have debate number 31, Halacha versus the state. Following this religious governmental theme, what is the ultimate vehicle towards progress? Law versus state versus religion and morality. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining us.